First, let me begin by clarifying the purpose of nonviolent communication. Its purpose is to help you to do what you already know how to do. Now, why do we need to learn something today that you already know how to do? Because sometimes we forget to do this. We forget because we've been educated to forget. Now, what is it that I'm talking about that we already know how to do? The purpose of this process is to help us to connect in a way that makes natural giving possible. Natural giving possible. What do I mean by natural giving? Let me do you a song to make it clear what I mean by natural giving. You all know that giving. You know how to do it. And that's what I'm interested in. Remembering to stay with that quality of giving, moment by moment in any connection. But we also all know that it's easy to lose it. It's easy to lose that connection, so that instead of enjoying that quality of giving, which is possible every moment in every contact we have, in spite of how precious that is, we forget. And instead of playing the game that song is about, which I call making life wonderful, it's the most fun game I've ever heard. Instead, much of the time we play another game called Who's Right? Have you ever played that game? See, it's a game where everybody loses. So isn't this amazing that we all know about this quality of giving that the song was about? It's possible every moment. We find that the richest thing to do, and much of our life we end up playing Who's Right. Now, the game of Who's Right involves two of the most devious things human beings have ever come upon. One, punishment. See, because if you're wrong in the game of Who's Right, then you deserve to suffer. Can you imagine a more diabolical concept to educate people? No more punishment. You won't do it in your families. We'll get rid of it with criminals. It just makes things more violent. We'll find other ways to deal with other nations beside punishment. No more punishment. No more reward. It's the same game. See, it's part of the game of Who's Right. If you're right, then you get rewarded. If you're wrong, you get punished. No more. No more. It's created enough violence on the planet. No more guilt induction. See? No more shame. No more concepts of duty and obligation. Just what the song is about. Natural giving.
Hello and welcome to this edition of TZM Global Radio. I'm your host for today, James Phillips from the London chapter of the Zeitgeist movement here in the UK and TZM Education. Hope you're all doing well out there, guys. So, just going to get started with a little bit of news today. The Zeitgeist Media Festival is coming up, with the main event being in LA on August the 4th. So it's not too far away now, guys, just a couple of weeks. So hope you've given some thought to maybe setting up a media festival near you. Doesn't have to be anything fancy or flash. Could just be playing some music for some friends in your garden, or even going out into a park so you don't even have to organise, something massive. Just go out there with some banners, sit, play some songs, and hopefully you'll attract a little bit of a crowd, or do whatever it is that you can do to help spread this message in a more aesthetic sense, which is of course an incredibly important medium by which to spread this message that we have of global sustainability through a social system that actually makes some sort of sense by addressing the root causes of problems technically, which can sometimes be a little bit off-putting to some people out there as seeming over-intellectualized. So hopefully with a mixture of art, satire, music and different aesthetic notions, we can translate this train of thought to a wider demographic, if you will. So, do give that some thought. I think I'm probably going to do something impromptu because I've been snowed under recently, as usual. As a communication movement, it is important to understand the two sides of communication, one being the lecturers and the other being the aesthetic. I don't think you can really have one without the other. Human beings aren't just robots who will take in the information and then change their point of view. You do have to kind of hit home where the heart is. Which brings me nicely on to the introduction to today's show, which were some words from Marshall Rosenberg, who is the founder of Nonviolent Communication, which was given a brief description both in words and in song, which sums up the sort of two directions I'm really talking about here. So if you're not really familiar with nonviolent communication, I strongly recommend checking it out. Have a look at the Centre for Nonviolent Communication, but I would also say get started by watching Marshall Rosenberg's talks on YouTube. Studying this method of communication has certainly given me a fascinating insight into how I go about communicating with people, that's for sure. I hadn't really realised how violent it had been, even in the terms of perhaps giving someone praise, because the whole position of non-violent communication comes from the perspective of feelings and needs, and really all human beings are ever saying is please and thank you in an attempt to meet a need of some sort. And very often we have a tragic way of expressing that because we live in a dominance culture which revolves around the idea of blame and punishment. Someone always has to be wrong, and if someone always has to be wrong, well then someone always has to be right, rather than attempting to connect with that person empathically by identifying what might be alive in them at that time, identifying what they're feeling and what they're needing. So for example, someone might say to you, you're just selfish. What our knee-jerk response might be is to say, I'm being selfish, you're the selfish one, or you can talk, or I'm not being selfish, because you feel victimized, you feel attacked. And so what is the response in that situation? The response is to defend or attack back. There's only two likely responses in that. But when you studied nonviolent communication, there could also be a third way. And that might be, for instance, to respond and say, are you feeling that your need for fairness has not been met by my actions? So instantly you've set up a dialogue for peace, and you've made an idea in nonviolent communication, which is that of natural giving, more possible. So what do I mean by that? I mean the idea that you can give to someone and you don't expect anything in return. You're giving for the gift of the giving. A really good example of this in my life that I always like to give to people, especially when I'm addressing the issues surrounding Christmas, is that a real gift is one that is given outside of your birthday, outside of Christmas, when you don't expect it, when there's a lot of thought behind it, and when the person didn't have to do it. So the example I often use is of an old drum student I had and good friend called Holly Brennan, who used to get me and my kids into this play centre that she worked at for free. And then she stopped working there, so we stopped going there. But she must have gone back during the summer, because one day soon after that I received a letter through my door with 2 gift vouchers allowing us for 2 more entries into this play centre, with a little note saying, James, I was just thinking of you on my last day here at the play centre and I sent these to you. Now, she would have actually had to have found an old invoice of mine, scribbled the address on the front of an envelope, got a stamp if she didn't already have one, put it on the front, fill out the gift certificates and fill out another sticky note, put it on the gift certificates, close up the envelope, put it in the post and send it to me. Wasn't my birthday, wasn't Christmas, didn't have to do it, didn't have to think of me, still did it anyway. Now that is one of the greatest gifts I've ever been given. I've been given a few like that, but it's a nice example, nice clear example of what natural giving is. It's a lovely thing to receive, and it's a lovely thing to give. Sometimes when it's really cold over here in the UK, I go outside, and I don't have a lot in common with my neighbours, so I don't tend to talk to them an awful lot, unfortunately. But what I do is I scrape the ice off their cars. I go out a little bit early whilst they're all in bed and scrape the ice off their cars and get in my car and drive off. It's my little thing. Let's hope they're not listening to this radio show, because I don't know. In my head, it's kind of nicer that they don't know who it is, although I'm sure they've probably guessed by now. Also, I like the fact that it probably freaks them out a little bit. I'm not going for the Good Samaritan award here or anything, but the world really is missing those little acts of random kindness. And I think if you're involved in this movement, then your values, at least, should in some way be orientated towards doing those sorts of things. Really, if we want a more peaceful world, then we're going to have to monitor the way we communicate with each other, what energy we give a gift out of or receive a gift in, and really take a look at how we communicate with each other in great detail. How are we supposed to have a planet without conflict when we still communicate in such a violent manner, perpetrated through the use of punishment, blame and reward, which are all essentially part of the same game called Who's Right? Which might be a fun game if you're on the side of being correct, but not if you're on the other side. And very often, when someone says something to you, if you attribute meaning to the words that they're using through your own association, then you're not really doing service to the speaker who is using those words, who has a completely different associative memory pattern with the words that they're using and the sequence in which they used them. Why not inquire into what they meant when they used those words, instead of just attributing meaning to the words? Because words are meaningless. They don't actually mean anything. They're sounds that are strung together by someone with a load of patterns in their head. So why not find out what they meant by those words when they used them? And that really comes back to general semantics as well, which has been a topic that has been discussed by us in the past. There is a bleed through, if you will, from general semantics to non-violent communication, in that non-violent communication wants to be clear and wants to get through to what people's feelings are and what the needs are behind those feelings, and takes the view that there is an abundance on this planet to be able to take care of everybody's needs. Everybody's needs can be met because ultimately human needs are universally the same. It's just that in a world predicated on scarcity and an economic system based on what can you do for me, it shouldn't really be that surprising that we've fallen into what we have, which is attributing blame to someone, because when you blame someone you can fine them, can't you? And you can make lots of money from that. So is it any wonder that we have this sort of system in place? Is it any wonder that we still have a legal and law system essentially predicated and based out of the idea that humans are agents of free will, that they're the only thing on this planet not connected to everything else, not reinforced to behave in a certain way? You know, you can reinforce animals to behave a certain way, but no, not humans. They make all their decisions completely on their own. This is obviously ridiculous. As Jacques Fresco once said, just because you can't see the plug up your arse doesn't mean it's not there. But Nevertheless, these phantoms still chase our culture around because we're just not willing to let go of whatever disposition we may have, whether it be religious, philosophical, or we're just hanging on to some wrong that someone has done us in the past, because apparently that makes us feel so much less stressed and far more happy for the brief time that we get on this planet. I am in no way saying that I have mastered this non-violent communication thing at all. In the past, I have most certainly not been the most peaceful of communicators in any way, shape or form, but that's part of the ride, isn't it? We live and learn. So I'm doing my best to try to change that now, especially seeing as I want to be part of a transition towards a more peaceful, collaborative and sustainable planet. And I think that considering we are a communication movement, we would surely want to look to the most effective methods of communication that limit violence and promote peace possible. And non-violent communication is one of these. It's been shown to work in many, many different situations. There are centres for non-violent communication in 60 different countries around the world. It's been shown to be incredibly successful in reducing conflict, along with methods such as general semantics as well, which I went through earlier. This is, of course, not to ignore the fact that if you have a more equal society, you will have a healthier population in general, less rates of homicides, less acts of violence, and more social trust. This should be expected from a system predicated on shame and punishment and blame, that you would have more violence. And non-violent communication can only go so far. If the environment is producing the stress response in the human being, then you're asking an awful lot of them to be less violent. But what can you do? You can only employ the language tools you have to try to get across your point, and to try to hopefully get to a stage where you can argue that you should have a more egalitarian society, that we should try to limit the root cause of violence. So the method of communication you use by which to get that point across is obviously incredibly important to understand. So non-violent communication is certainly something worth checking out, which is why one of the speakers at London Z-Day this year in March was Darren DeWitt from Nonviolent Communication. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to include Darren's talk, which should hopefully be a little bit more specific in detailing what it is that nonviolent communication is all about. And just so you understand the opening of this talk, there is a joke that's relevant to how the day unfolded. In the equality lecture, Sean Bain questioned the fact that there were no women speakers on that day, and there was a bit of a discussion afterwards, and so I think as this lecture opens, that context should help you to understand the nature of Darren's opening remarks. So without further ado, I give you Darren DeWitt from the Centre for Nonviolent Communication at Z-Day London 2013.
I'm feeling really uncomfortable at the moment because I'm not female. And I'm also feeling uncomfortable because I'm imagining some people might want to break. That's scary as well. I don't know I'm actually feeling a little bit overwhelmed with all the information. Who else is feeling a little bit overwhelmed? You're used to it. Okay, it's a few people feeling overwhelmed. Okay, who's actually really enjoying it and quite keen to learn some more? Oh, okay, wow, cool. Who's hungry and would like their lunch? Okay. And who's kind of a little frustrated and would actually like more kind of participation and engagement in the day? There's a few people. Okay. So actually, I think you're doing pretty well on the whole. Most people seem really happy. Yeah, I'd like to just share a little bit about nonviolent communication and how I feel it can contribute to some of the aims and objectives of the Zeitgeist movement. And I think, well, I've got it up there on the wall. I think nonviolent communication is a language that matches the new social paradigm that we wish to create. It's a language of partnership rather than a language of domination. So I think it can be helpful to support us in moving forward to a more of a partnership kind of world. And also it can support an economic system based on human needs, which is very similar to the resource-based kind of economy that the Zeitgeist movement wants to create. And then also nonviolent communication can support us when dialoguing with people with differing views from us. That can be challenging. I'm sure any of you who've tried to get your ideas across to other people have found challenges there. And I think nonviolent communication can help with that. In fact, in a way, that's how it originated, really. It originated in the 1960s with a guy called Marshall Rosenberg, and he was a psychologist in the 60s who was trying out some quite radical ideas, at the time quite radical ideas. And he was called in to mediate conflicts between black and white people. It was during the period of desegregation in America, and he was called in to mediate conflicts. And that's partly where the term nonviolent comes from. It's a reference to Martin Luther King and going back to Gandhi as well, and their advocacy of nonviolent activism. And this is kind of taking it maybe a little bit into the realm of communication. So what Marshall Rosenberg found was he had these people that wanted to resolve their conflicts. They'd come together to mediation to resolve their conflicts, yet the way they were talking to one another was actually making the conflict worse. So they'd end up sort of arguing and kind of fighting with one another, and it was about the way they were talking to one another. And Marshall Rosenberg was really curious about this, and he kind of wondered, why on earth is this happening? Why do people talk like this to one another? And so he did some study. He read anthropology, he read history, he read religion, and the idea that he liked most, that he came up with, that seemed to him to explain why this was happening, was the idea of domination cultures, and that the language that people were talking was coming from a kind of heritage of domination cultures. A kind of language of coercion and manipulation. So historically, we come from societies that are more structured, more hierarchically structured. So in the old days, you had kings and queens, you had aristocracy, then you had maybe middle classes and peasants. And so it was very hierarchically structured, and the people with more power imposed their will on the people with less power, and they did that physically, but they also did that with the language that they were using. And so, in a way, we're moving towards wanting more equality in the world, more partnership, but we sort of carry with us a little bit of the baggage of the language of our culture from the past, the more domination style culture. So some of the types of language that Marshall Rosenberg noticed actually seemed to exacerbate conflict. One was a way of talking where you didn't really give people choice, the idea of no choice language. So things like, you can't do this, and you have to do that, and you must do this. And this kind of goes against something I think quite fundamental in all of us as human beings, that we all want choice. We all want to be able to make our own decisions about what we want to do, in our lives. And this goes back to a very early age. If you try to, I don't know if you've tried to feed a 18-month-old child in a high chair, and if that child doesn't want to eat, you can't get the spoon in its mouth. So this is very fundamental in us, that we really want choice. And blame is another type of language, focusing the blame on other people. This is your fault. And quite often that kind of induces guilt. The other person starts to feel guilty, about what they're doing and uncomfortable about what they're doing if it's described as their fault. So there's also demands, with threats. In the time of kings, if you went against the will of the king, or possibly the queen, then you could, the punishment was to be hung, drawn, and quartered. And I saw online there was a previous talk from a previous year, I think, where someone described in quite vivid detail what it was like to be hung, drawn, and quartered, and it wasn't fun. I think in the workplace, I think there's this kind of subtle threat of, if you don't toe the line, you will lose your job. And I think that's why I notice quite often when I go into businesses, organizations, in the workplace, you get, I don't know if you've noticed this, you get the kind of staff will be talking amongst themselves and sort of sniping about the management. And but not ever actually going up to the manager and actually saying, we're really frustrated with this, we're not happy with this. More often than not, there's just a lot of kind of backbiting and talking amongst themselves. I don't know if other people have noticed that. Have you noticed that in workplaces? Yeah. So there's this kind of threat, and it's almost implicit. It's not explicit. It's certainly there. And kind of alongside that is the idea of incentives. Rewarding people for doing what you want them to do, and this is embedded in our social systems and in our education especially. So you get a smiley sticker for doing what the teacher wants, and then you get grades, you get medals, and we're kind of programmed to do things for reward, and the reward that we end up with, that we're most programmed for, is money. So we're doing things for money rather than for any other reason. We don't even know what other reason. We want, we want the money. Okay. Other types of language comparison. Again, in the school. Look, Susie's sitting quietly doing her work. Why aren't you sitting quietly doing your work? So we're made to feel uncomfortable because of being compared to other people. And we're gradually moving away from a focus on ourselves and what's true for us, inside us, and our attention is drawn to what other people want us to do. So comparisons, comparing our behavior with the behavior of someone else. And labels, selfish, greedy, naive. So if I want your help, then I'll call you selfish, and that's supposed to get you to, want to help me. Yeah? I mean, if I tell you you're selfish, do you feel like helping me? No, you don't. It actually gets your back up if I tell you you're selfish. But bizarrely, this is what we do. When you're really frustrated with someone, you tell them they're selfish or they're lazy or they're inconsiderate, and somehow expecting that that's going to make them do what you want them to do. So this is another type of the language that Marshall Rosenberg noticed. And also what in nonviolent communication we call moralistic judgments. So particularly around the concepts of right and wrong and good and bad. And I personally think that these concepts are one of the biggest contributors to violence on our planet. And I remember at the time of the Twin Towers, when the Twin Towers were hit, September 9/11, a couple of days after that, George Bush came on the television and he said, the reason why they did this, the reason why they hit the Twin Towers, is because we are good. And I was just like, how on earth did he come up with that? And I think, but the way I interpreted it was, the world is divided into good people and bad people. And some of the good people are so good that they protect the other good folk of the world from the bad guys. It's kind of a bit like the sheriff in a Western, protecting the townsfolk. And of course, if you're in that role of being the protector, every now and then the bad guys take a shot at you. So this is what's happened. The bad guys have taken a shot at us. Yeah. And then you go across to Osama bin Laden. He was actually thinking the same thing. In a way, these guys were twins. So Osama bin Laden, he was saying, you know, George Bush is the embodiment of Satan, and he needs to be annihilated. And he's doing the work of Allah, or the work of good.
Sorry to jump in here, guys. Rather unorthodox interruption. The reason for this being is that there was actually a break in the audio from this lecture, so it jumps a little bit from this point onto the next one. But just to build a bridge, at this point Darren's obviously talking about good and bad, right and wrong, if you will, which frames up his next point that he's going to move on to, which is the idea of these words being connected to whether you are right or wrong. So back to Darren.
Is this the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do? And then we relate to people in that sort of way. So if I'm in a conflict with you, I'm the right one, as far as I'm concerned, and that immediately makes you the wrong one. And how do you feel if I'm telling you you're wrong or you're bad? How are you going to feel? How might you feel if I'm telling you you're wrong or you're bad? Angry.
Guilty.
Upset. Yeah, angry, guilty, maybe upset. Yeah, and so you'll either attack me back, or you'll withdraw. And this is partly the problem, is you've only got two choices, and if you're evaluating, so you're putting things into these two camps. So for me, it's a little bit like, I think the evolution, if you like, is a little bit like the change when people used to see the world as flat, and then, you know, we started to see it as round. And I think in the way we evaluate situations, we need to make that kind of radical change in the way we view the world. And I think we need to move on from seeing the world in terms of right and wrong, evaluating in terms of right and wrong. And that's still how a lot of parents and even school teachers, they think that's their job, to teach children the difference between right and wrong. I think we need to move on to a different way of evaluating, and that's in terms of needs, making evaluations in terms of needs, because we need to evaluate our situations so we know what to do. But if we make needs-based judgments, I would say they're more essential. They get to the core of what is alive in us, and I think they also allow for the complexity that is part of being alive and being human. And I think they're more inclusive as well. You don't get this polarization with people. And it relates, I think the needs are more closely related to what's really going on for us as human beings. So the way I see it, as humans, we have needs. And needs are the kind of motivation for us doing anything in life. From our needs arises feelings. So, for instance, we have a need for food, and you know, when that need kind of arises, we feel hungry. Who's feeling hungry now? A few people feeling hungry now. So, and what that feeling of hunger does is it actually propels us to act. So we have a need for food, and it gives rise to a feeling. The feeling of hunger, and that propels us to act. So in a minute, when we're finished, based on that feeling of hunger arising out of your need for food, it will move you out of the room, unless you've got your sandwiches in your bag. But it'll move you out your room to wherever you're going. You'll go on the hunt for some food, and then you'll get the food and you'll eat the food, and then how will you feel? Satisfied. Yeah. So this is how we function as human beings. This is our makeup. This is our nature as human beings. We have needs. Needs give rise to feelings, and the feelings. Another word for feeling is emotion, and I like that because in the word emotion is a sense of motion. So feelings move us to act. So again, with water, you know, we need water. So every hour or so, you feel thirsty, and you go and get a drink, and then you feel satisfied around that need, and it kind of subsides again. Food is every 2 or 3 hours. Sleep maybe once a day. You know, at the end of the day, you feel really tired. That moves you into your bed, and you get some sleep. Maybe in the afternoon, you get a short nap during lunchtime if you're lucky. So as well as physical needs, we also have interpersonal needs, because I think we are social animals. Human beings we don't function completely in isolation. For a start, it takes 2 humans to make a human. So you need at least 2 or 3 to begin with. But since the dawn of time, we've always lived in groups. And part of living in groups is that we have needs, interpersonal needs. So things like trust, equality, respect, meaning, freedom, emotional safety, to contribute, clarity. These are the kinds of needs that we have to do with our interacting with other human beings. And these needs also give rise to feelings. So this is our nature as human beings. We have these needs to do with our interacting with people. They give rise to feelings, and then hopefully we act in a way that will meet the need in relation to each other. Our interpersonal needs are maybe not as fundamental as subsistence needs, like food and water. If you don't get food and water, you'll die. With our interpersonal needs, we're not going to die, but we feel it. When you don't get respect, you feel it. And, the recent uprisings in countries like Egypt, the Near Eastern countries, they were uprising because of things like fairness, equality, respect, as well as maybe some basic needs. And they felt it, and they were actually willing to risk their lives for these needs. So these needs are very strong motivators in us all. Marshall Rosenberg, he felt that he defined what he thought there were basically about 10 different areas of human need, which I quite like, to have a kind of sense of what's going on for me in different situations, and also what's going on for other people. And anything anyone ever says or does, I would say they say or do things to meet a need. And I think this is why, if we move from a kind of right-wrong way of evaluating to a needs way of evaluating, we're getting more to the core and to the essence of what's going on for us in any different situation. So it's more true to what's really happening to make those kinds of evaluations. And also, we can, if we're in a conflict with someone, we can look at, okay, what are my needs and what are their needs in the conflict? Because we can only get our needs met if the other people around us are getting their needs met as well. We're not, if we're getting our needs met and other people around us aren't, sooner or later they're gonna be unhappy and start causing conflict. I just thought I'd mention a guy called Manfred Max Neef. He's actually done some, he's a Chilean economist. He was professor in Berkeley University. He went back to Chile, I believe, and spent 10 or 20 years working with the poor. And he really saw the value in changing the way we looked at economics, and he created a needs-based economy. He's written a book called Human Scale Development, and you can find that online. It's freely available. And he talked about that wealth is not just the material wealth. Wealth is actually, we can have a wealth in terms of our needs being met. We are wealthy or poor according to whether our needs are being met. And I think there are very wealthy people who aren't very happy. And we can have a wealth in different ways. So I went and did some work in a Camp Hill community on the border of Wales, and they work with people with learning difficulties, and they do permaculture as well. And this community, they had 8 houses on the land, and the people with learning difficulties lived in houses with a family, and they worked the land and they had workshops. And I actually felt that in terms of community, they were richer than I was, and they were healthier than I was. When I went around that place, people just seemed really happy, actually, and really healthy. And it really struck me, especially living in London. I don't know my neighbours in London, I don't have a sense of local community. I've got to try and build it with connections with people all over the city. It's not easy. But these people were rich in community. That need was being met really, really well. And yeah, Manfred Max Neef, he's got a grid of human needs. He's got 9 basic human needs, and he talks about satisfiers. So needs are kind of are permanent and don't change over time within human beings. You know, they're very essential. But the way we satisfy those needs change over time. And he's done quite a lot of sort of investigation into that and different types of satisfiers and so on, which I won't go into now because we're almost out of time. So working with nonviolent communication, I often use it in the context of mediation and conflict resolution. And what we're looking at with this process is to create an empathic connection with ourselves and others through which everyone's needs can be respectfully addressed through natural giving. And this is the idea, partly the idea behind this is actually, as humans, we like to contribute. That's our basic nature. We like to give. I think there's a guy called Jeremy Rifkin. I don't know if you've heard of him. He talks about the empathic civilization. And he's suggesting that humans are essentially empathic rather than selfish. So if in nonviolent communication, we suggest that if we can get connected on the level of our needs, then any conflict can be resolved if you can connect 2 people on the level of their needs. And the feelings, it's like a human connection between 2 people, the feelings that arise from their needs. We also talk about observations and requests. So how you describe what's happening, free of evaluation and free of all the labels and judgments, and also how you ask people for things, how you ask people to get your needs met. That's kind of part of the process as well. Often when people are in conflict, they judge and criticize one another, attack one another. And we say that's tragic because when you attack someone, when you tell them they're selfish, it actually moves you further away from getting your need met, from getting connection with that person. So if we learnt to connect with our needs and our feelings and to communicate them and to connect with the needs and feelings of other people, then we can resolve our conflicts a lot more easily. So I was asked to think of some Zeitgeistian type conflicts that might go on, and I googled criticisms of the Zeitgeist movement, and yeah, I came up with something a bit like, this is just naive pie-in-the-sky techno-utopianism, which the Zeitgeist movement wants to impose on the world like a fascist state. Dream on, you've just been brainwashed by Peter Joseph's clever movies. Okay. To which, if you were a true follower, you might reply, "You're the naive, brainwashed one, mindlessly consuming and polluting the earth. The world is heading for disaster, and you carry on with your head buried in the sand while your actions are destroying the planet." Okay. But at the same time, you're thinking inwardly, oh my God, maybe this person's right. Maybe this is just a fantasy that will never materialize. Yeah? The world, maybe I should just give up. This is all too much. Okay? This is the way we judge in our heads. We judge others and we judge ourselves. So let's see if we can do a little translation. So this person who's saying that this is naive, pie-in-the-sky techno-utopianism, which the Zeitgeist movement wants to impose on the world. What do you think this person's needs are, would you say, from this?
Security.
Security? In what sense?
He thinks we're going to take away all this stuff. Lack of autonomy.
Okay, so autonomy. So he wants freedom. He basically wants the freedom to choose what he does, or she. Yeah. Any other needs?
Feel cleverer than other people.
Sorry?
They want to feel cleverer than other people.
He wants to feel cleverer than other people. This person does. Okay, so that was what we would call a kind of evaluation or a diagnosis of the person rather than the person's needs. Yeah. So if we're going to dialogue with this person, we want to get to what are their needs. So I hear they need freedom. Anyone else?
I see more insecurity than security. Because when I say
This person feels insecure.
insecure,
Yeah.
insecure because
Yeah.
see for something completely different that doesn't know how is going to be my role in this new world,
Yeah.
and that is a little bit insecurity.
Okay. So he'd like to know that he has a place in the world. So that's a need to.
It's a completely new world.
Yeah. Yeah. For me, I also see that there's something about this term techno-utopianism. So for me, there's maybe I could imagine the person thinking, you've got this great vision and you can see the sort of that wheel, the Venus Project wheel, and it all, it just looks a bit sort of far-fetched. And so I think there's a need, I would say, that someone may be thinking like that. They really want things to be grounded and practical. Yeah. So if you say that, so that you're really wanting to know you have freedom, you're really wanting things to be grounded and practical, and then we check in with ourselves. Well, actually, I want that too. If I was a part of the Zeitgeist movement, I'd imagine I would want those things as well. So that you start to create connection, and then your response, you're the naive, brainwashed one, mindlessly consuming and polluting the earth. So what's that? What are we trying to say in terms of our needs there? What needs are we trying to express there? Or feelings. I think there's a lot of feeling in this.
Feel
Attacked, yeah. Frustration. Feeling a lot of frustration. Yeah. Needing to be understood. Yeah, needing to be understood. I would say I feel personally I feel a lot of anxiety when I think about the way the world's heading. I have a lot of fear. And I really want to know that we can do something about this. I want to make a contribution. I maybe even feel some despair, actually, when I think about the state of the world. So if we start talking in this kind of way, we get a different type of connection. Okay? And then from that, you get a human connection between both of you, and then you can move forward with people together. And maybe through people expressing their needs, we might learn things for ourselves, yeah, that we can take on board. Because we all share the same needs. So if someone's talking about something, they're alerting us to a need that may be there to be recognized. Okay, I think that's probably about all we've got time for. The main website of nonviolent communication is cnbc.org. Marshall Rosenberg's book, Nonviolent Communication, A Language of Life, is kind of like the core book that people read if you're interested in following this up. Also, there's some very good clips of him on YouTube these days. There's actually a 3-hour seminar that he led that's really good, gives you an overview of the process. I work in London, and there's also a reference to Manfred Max Neef there. You can see it. It's not quite... Yeah, it's got a bit blurred there. But anyway, you can look him up as well. I think that's probably all we've got time for, yeah? Okay.
Okay, so hope you enjoyed that, guys. I think that sums up nonviolent communication reasonably well, but there's obviously a lot more that you can learn about this method of communication. And the actual example near the end of that lecture is quite interesting, because that literally was a discussion online that Darren found between a movement member and a critic of this direction. And I think that really frames just how important this topic is to our movement, and just how important this type of communication is for our world. Because the tragedy of it is that both of you are not going to get your needs met when you communicate in this way. It makes it less likely that you'll get your needs met, and increases the chances of violence. How does anybody want that? Of course, nobody wants that. But we keep going and doing the same thing over and over and over again in the hope that magically next time it will work out differently. And even if it does work out, it will be at the expense of someone not having their needs met, and it just burrows the frustration and the hurt for just another time in that person. And it doesn't have to be that way. Another example of that exchange would be in the use of general semantics. Once you maybe have made an empathic connection, is say, and I would really like to know what you mean by a techno-utopia. What specifically are you referring to? Do you find this to be similar to something that you have looked at in the past? I'd like to take a look at it. You're showing an interest. I think it's been said that people are interested in people who are interested in them, or at least in this case interested in their needs, interested in their feelings, why they feel a certain way. It's important to remember that we have all grown up in a culture that uses this sort of language, and sometimes when you think that you're resolving a conflict and you're speaking calmly, the language that you're using could be implying wrongness and blame rather than getting through to what someone's needs are. It's perfectly understandable as well. The need for food and water is quite an easy one in terms of attributing the feeling, the need, and the response. That is quite a clear correlation. But when you're dealing with people's connections, emotions, relationships, feelings, it starts to get bound up in words of a higher order of abstraction, as it would be termed in general semantics, which means that you're very far away from the physical referent for your communications, and the higher order abstract word that you're using won't mean the same thing to everybody who uses that word, especially when they frame it in their own context at the time that they used it. So you get huge misunderstandings along the lines of freedom and democracy, and these sorts of higher order abstractions that couldn't be pointed to in the physical environment in which you exist. And even if they could, they'd change. So you've got this problem with language as it stands anyway. But I think that the combination of these two methods of communication could help to bring about a more peaceful world in which we would want to have a system of communication that means that we can stop the blame and the punishment and the rights and the wrongs of it and get through to making a more empathic connection. Now, just one more thing to mention on this topic is that that doesn't mean that you can't, poke a little fun or maybe produce some pretty funny satire. And I don't think we should give up on these particular moments, but when we can see that a connection needs to be made, when we're in a serious conversation with someone, when we're trying to resolve a conflict, when we're trying to be clear. So I really, really do encourage you to not just take it for granted that how you're communicating is necessarily the most effective way. Keep it under constant review. I know I certainly do, as a member of a communication organisation, as I'm sure you are too if you're listening to this broadcast. So hopefully we can communicate in the manner by which we want the world to change. So be the light of change you wish to see in the world. Well, if you're going around being violent with your language or with your fists, I don't think you should really expect to live in a non-violent world based on peace and collaboration. That doesn't seem like a very likely outcome. So what could be more important than making sure that we are communicating in a manner of non-violence when we wish to create a non-violent world? I can't think of anything more important. So I hope that I've managed to get some of that across. There will be a future radio show on these topics, but with the next one focusing more heavily on general semantics, because last week myself and Darren did a separate event expanding on the topic of communication. So I would like to include the audio from that in a future radio show. But for now, I'm going to get on to the next portion of the show, which is the next reading from the First Civilization. and we're picking it up from page 57. If you'd like to read along, you can find the PDF for the first civilization online, either through the Zeitgeist Movement website or by typing it into Google with perhaps Jas Garcha's name next to it, and then you should find it that way as well. Section 3. This is the test. The saddest aspect of life right now is that science gathers knowledge faster than society gathers wisdom. Isaac Asimov. We now have some idea of how an RBE would function, and we've gone through some objections and queries in order to show the logical strength that underlies this idea. But how do we ensure that this system would actually work? No matter how great we think the RBE is, and no matter how much support the idea receives from the people, it is of little consequence until we actually have some idea of whether or not this system would function. The only way to determine this is by putting the RBE concept to the test. In fact, the entire book up till this point can be thought of as a rationale for what I will propose in this section. A concrete plan that would allow us to test this system and make necessary corrections until we produce a system that functions as well as physically possible. Here I will outline a general plan consisting of 6 major steps that might give us the key to changing the face of our entire global society. Once again, I will stress that this plan is not meant to be a completely comprehensive instruction guide. Instead, what I have done is create a kind of skeleton that could be used to form the general structure of a testing protocol. As with my actual description of an RBE, this outline is not set in stone. I fully expect that it will be replaced in part or entirely by better ideas and superior plans that I was not able to think of. My purpose is simply to show how the testing of an RBE would ideally occur, by presenting an example of a testing procedure. The basic premise is to engage in a series of experiments that would allow us to test the RBE concept while simultaneously paving the way for its implementation. It goes something like this. Gather the knowledge, test the technology, test the basic concept on a small scale with very few variables, slowly increase the scale while adding variables and complexity, test the concept on a larger scale, and use this as a platform for further expansion and implementation. The ultimate goal of this plan is to create at least one fully functioning, self-sufficient automated city or colony which would serve as an example of this new system. From this, we would have a much stronger platform for getting the RBE idea recognized and implemented on larger and larger scales, thus giving us a solid foundation from which to push for global implementation. However, it would be wise for us to avoid making the same mistake of times past and thinking that our theoretical system will function perfectly well when implemented. We will instead proceed with extreme caution. The true strength of this plan lies in its flexibility. We need to be able to give ourselves enough leeway to adjust parameters and experimental procedures as needed, rather than planning each phase in isolation. Every step takes future steps into account and is dependent upon previous steps for guidance, thus allowing us to take advantage of success and adjust for shortcomings. This process of careful examination has given us all of the scientific wonders of the modern world, from sandals to satellites. Now let's see what it can do for society. Step 1. Assemble. We begin by holding some kind of conference or other large meeting in order to bring together technical experts along with other scientific and artistic minds who are interested in pursuing the RBE system. The purpose of this meeting would be to allow for direct communication between the groups who will ultimately be responsible for designing the experiments and building the technologies that will make an RBE happen. In other words, we need to start doing some serious planning. By holding an annual conference or meeting, we would ensure that there would be a forum for all interested parties to present their ideas to each other and facilitate intergroup learning. This would also be a good opportunity for the minds behind various technologies to begin integrating their ideas together. For example, the vertical farm people could talk to the evacuated tube transport people to discuss how the farms and tube technology could be combined to allow for efficient shipping of food. The folks behind the bit car may want to have a word or two with groups working on autonomous automobiles. Basically, everyone will want to learn more about additive manufacturing, since they'll need to know if and how their specific technologies can be built using this fabrication technique. The list of possible technological collaborations is a very long one. It would also be advisable for this conference to be open to the public as well, so that it could become a platform for those involved to directly engage and educate the public about their ideas and the progress being made towards having a concrete plan for the RBE experiment. Transparency to the public is extremely important, since we're ultimately trying to get the public to support this idea. After a few meetings, perhaps even the first one, we would be at a point where we could begin organising task groups to plan out specific aspects of the test community. For example, one group might focus on energy generation, while another focuses on infrastructure for water and waste, and a third group might get to work on the experimental design itself. There are two major goals that need to be accomplished here before we can proceed to the next step. 1. We must have comprehensive computer models, and at least small-scale physical models, for every piece of technology and every aspect of the test communities. This is critical, because additive manufacturing requires computer models to build from. By having these models created at this point, the actual experimental process will be much smoother and more efficient. 2. We will need to begin planning the actual experiments, including the creation of the first wave of surveys that will be used to run the test cities. At this stage, it would be too early to have a concrete plan laid out for the entire process. We must ensure that we remain flexible in the event that necessary changes must be made. But the first stage, at least, should be well defined, and a general idea of how to proceed following this stage should exist. We should also have a good idea of how we will recruit subjects and what the inclusion and exclusion criteria for selecting subjects will be. By ensuring that we must meet these two major criteria, we could smoothly move into the testing phase when we are ready. This would also be the time to take care of the mountain of bureaucracy and paperwork that will need to be overcome before this kind of large-scale experiment can begin. This is going to take a lot of time and energy, much of which will detract directly from time and energy spent working on the actual project, as anyone with experience in research will be painfully familiar with. Unfortunately, this is an unavoidable reality of scientific experimentation in our current system, and it will have to be dealt with. I cannot even begin to fathom how large this mountain will be, or what endless forms and files it will consist of, but we have no choice other than to climb it. An optional addition to this step would be to form task groups who are specifically pushing for the implementation of systems other than an RBE. In fact, the meetings themselves could be orientated towards exploring a variety of alternative socio-economic systems, with an RBE simply being one of them. This is not to encourage competition between the systems, but cooperation and mutual learning. By having a number of systems being tested simultaneously, it would be possible for each system to learn from the triumphs and shortcomings of the other test systems, thus increasing the chances of creating at least one highly functional and stable socio-economic system. Testing multiple systems is not 100% necessary for this testing plan, but there are certainly advantages in proceeding that way. This plan is written out assuming that we only test the RBE concept, but the logic used here could apply to the testing of many experimental social systems, particularly any relying heavily on technology. The purpose of step 1 is to allow the subsequent steps to proceed with the least amount of time and wasted energy. Extra effort would still need to be expended for making necessary tweaks to the experimental design as we go, as well as measuring and interpreting the data and keeping the public informed as to the overall progress. However, this planning step should also allow us to be well prepared for every future step so that we can proceed from one step to the next with relatively little delay. Once we have models for all of the test communities and a well-defined experimental methodology, we can proceed to step 2. I predict that this planning step will take about 5 years to progress to a point at which we are justified in proceeding. Step 2. Establish a fully automated extraction production facility. This step is all about establishing a facility that is able to extract raw materials, refine them, and craft them into usable products all in one place and without any human labour. This facility should include, at a minimum, a permanent and reliable source of power, depending on location and environment, any of geothermal, solar, wind, tidal wave, or a combination thereof should be suitable. A resource extraction mining system to allow the facility to obtain as many of the aggregates as possible for making concrete, which will likely be the primary construction material. Other materials might need to be shipped in, but imported materials should be kept to a minimum. A refining sector to convert the mined raw materials into usable form. A vertical farm capable of producing both food and plant material for the creation of thermoplastics. A manufacturing centre that is at a minimum capable of creating machines of varying size for additive manufacturing and a variety of thermoplastic goods. A system for transporting goods to the nearby cities. This will likely take the form of a vac train system. The purpose of this step is twofold: to test the basic technologies on which an RBE is reliant, and to create the technical foundation for the construction of the first test community. Ideally, the entire facility will be built automatically through additive manufacturing and other advanced fabrication techniques. The initial contributions of a temporary power source, a few contour crafting robots, the raw materials, and perhaps a small amount of human labour should be the only external input required in order to construct this facility. The specific ends this facility is used for will ultimately be up to whoever footed the bill for its construction and the rights to build on the land. We won't have escaped capitalism yet. Depending on the mindset of the person or group who provided the capital, they might use this facility to cheaply produce goods and sell them in the market in order to cover the investment costs and perhaps make a profit. A more altruistic philanthropist might instead use this facility to provide food and needed goods for the poor, or even to ship food to impoverished nations. A government-funded facility might sell goods abroad and use the profits to reimburse the taxpayers or even to fund social programs and the like. Any of these scenarios would provide us with a thorough real-world experiment to test whether or not a fully automated extraction, refining, production, shipping facility would actually function well. We would have an ideal proof of principle experiment for the basic technologies on which the RBE concept is built. It would be advisable to allow this kind of experiment to run for at least 2 to 5 years, so that we would have ample time and data to base our evaluations on. Once we are confident that the facility is functioning well, we could move on to step 3, where this facility is used to actually construct the first test community. This is where the transition takes a very interesting turn, since we have a facility that is not only able to extract and refine raw materials, but also provide food, energy, and automated construction robots. There would be almost no need for additional funding or human labour for the remainder of the entire RBE project. Once the automated facility is up and running, we should be able to carry on with little to no dependence on the capitalist system. The facility would act like a self-replicating organism, automatically creating the first test community using the energy and resources that it gathers itself. As an added bonus, the ability of a production facility and a community to automatically build themselves with minimal human involvement would greatly aid our ability to colonize space, where shipping in migrant workers might be a tad less practical. While Step 2 is being carried out, this would also be a good time to begin recruiting subjects and finalizing plans for Step 3. During the recruitment phase, it will be important to remember that anyone acting as a subject in these experiments will likely enjoy an increased standard of living, but will also face the risk of a small-scale societal collapse should the experiment fail. This is a very real risk, and the public should be made aware of it. This would also be a good time to answer the following questions. What will happen to the subject's property, job, and other attachments to capitalist society whilst they are participating in this experiment? Will there be a set time each subject spends in the experiment, or will they be allowed to stay in this new society as long as they like? How do we compensate the subjects should the RBE experiment fail? Unfortunately, I don't have the answers to these questions, but they will all need to be addressed before we can begin Step 3. Step 3. Use of the production facility to create the first test village. Once the production facility is tested and confirmed to be running well, we can move into the first step in which something resembling an RBE will actually form. In this step, the production facility is used to bring the computer models we devised in Step 1 into reality. We will create a small test village, which should have the following characteristics. A very small population, perhaps only 50 to 100 people, plus a small team of researchers. During this step, only adults without violent criminal records or a history of untreated violent behaviour would be taken as subjects. Children would not be a part of the first round of experimentation and would not be taken as subjects. Obviously, this means that whole families would not be able to take part in this experiment during the earliest stage. Food would be provided entirely through vertical farms. Since artificial meat production still has much progress to make, the inhabitants would be limited to an entirely vegetarian diet. However, fish farms could be built if the village is near a large enough body of water, and individuals could always head into the bush and do their own subsistence hunting if they so desired. Due to the massive amount of wasted space and pollution caused by keeping livestock, this practice would be avoided. Once artificial meat production is sufficiently advanced, the very idea of keeping livestock or hunting for food would become largely obsolete anyway. In addition to housing, vertical farms and sustainable energy generators, the village should also include basic medical facilities, a recreational centre, a library or other facility to encourage learning and study, and a research facility in which to conduct on-site experiments. A building module that acts as a control centre or digital brain would be required in order to keep the village running by managing production and distribution. Depending on how the village is constructed, this could be integrated directly into the library or research facility. It would be wise to include some kind of rapid transport to the nearest city in case of emergency, most likely a vac train. The purpose of this step is to establish a fully functioning village under the parameters of a resource-based economy, thus creating the first RBE colony. Ideally, multiple villages would be built around the world simultaneously, so that we would not be limited to a single experimental system from which to draw all of our findings. During this initial phase, I would advise that we should avoid including children, since there will be no education system in place and we are not yet certain if the RBE concept will work. Including children before we have shown that an RBE would be a stable society is a significant safety risk. In addition, I highly recommend that at this stage we avoid taking individuals who would be at a high risk of performing violent actions, since this would add a potentially volatile complication to our experiment. Although both children and individuals with violent histories will eventually be introduced, we must first ensure that we obtain proof of principle for the RBE system. That is, we must be able to show that under these extremely ideal conditions, a small population consisting entirely of non-violent consenting adults, an RBE will function well. The easiest way for a promising experiment to fail miserably is to make the system too complicated from the start. We must keep things as simple as possible until we can prove that an RBE can at least function under these favourable conditions. Once we have observed the first village for a period of at least 1 year and confirmed that it is running satisfactorily, we can begin relaxing restrictions and adding more subjects, thereby increasing the system's complexity. But how exactly do we evaluate the village's function? Since this whole endeavour is ultimately about improving human lives and reducing environmental destruction, these would be good gauges to look for our answer. In order to monitor the physical health of the subjects, we could use technologies such as the mirror that measures blood pressure and other vitals, which we discussed in section 1. Once a month, every subject stands in front of a mirror in their homes, records their vitals, and sends this information to the research team. Mental health could be monitored through self-assessment surveys, a common practice in psychological research. It could include questions such as, how happy do you feel? Or how much stress are you experiencing? On a scale from 1 to 10, amongst other questions. Once again, monthly surveys could be sent out electronically for each subject to fill out and send back to the research team. On the topic of surveys, we should also keep in mind that the subjects themselves will be exercising control over the experiment through the surveys that ultimately govern the village. It would be a good idea to perform in-depth physical and psychological examinations on each subject once every 6 months or so in order to gain more detailed data. There should also be an environmental research team that monitors the health of the local environment. Air and water quality, the health of local plant and animal life, and the state of local resources should all be carefully tracked so that we actually know whether or not this kind of society is having less of an impact on the environment than today's society. It would be advisable to report and publish findings on an annual basis so that the scientific community and the public at large are aware of what has been found. We also need to give some consideration to how the village will be built. One option is to build it like a traditional village with mostly separate buildings connected by roads or other infrastructure. If we use this method, it might be necessary to maintain a small fleet of bit cars in order to provide a form of transportation around the village, depending on its size, particularly during subsequent steps when the village expands. However, there is also the option of constructing the entire village as a single building. Plans already exist for a 1 kilometre high tower built upon nearly identical principles to an RBE, and this completely autonomous tower/city would be able to house 10 to 50,000 people. Constructing a small-scale version of this building to house a few hundred people would not only provide advantages in terms of construction, such as not having to move contour crafting robots from place to place, but it would also provide an ideal small-scale test for the full-size tower/city. Once again, the ability to house an entire community within a single structure would be of great advantage in our efforts to colonize space, or even just to colonize the ocean. Whichever village design we choose to go with, we should be able to construct the entire village from the computer models we devised in step 1 using contour crafting robots. This brings us to the question of resources. If there are resources required for the construction and maintenance of the village, but they cannot be extracted there, which is almost entirely unavoidable, how will the village obtain them? If there is monetary profit to be made from the original production facility, some of that profit could be used to purchase resources to aid the village. However, such a practice would make the village dependent on the market system. Considering that this is precisely the system we are trying to escape from, actively engaging it might not be the best idea. Another option would be to directly trade goods for the needed resources, but this would pull us into a similar dilemma. There would need to be monetary value placed on RBE goods in order to allow for this kind of trade, so we would ultimately still be engaging the market system. Unfortunately, unless we can reach a level of advancement whereby we can simulate the properties of absolutely all of the materials necessary to keep society running, any RBE colonies will still be partly dependent upon the capitalist world for some time. As the experiment progresses, advances in material science will hopefully allow the villages to become completely autonomous, assuming those advances haven't already happened by the time we build the first village. If at the 1 year mark the first test village seems to be running smoothly, we could begin implementing the first set of expansions. Step 4. Expand the villages and experimental variables. If we find that the test village is functioning well, that is, the subjects are displaying good physical and mental health, are indicating their satisfaction, and the natural environment seems to be stable, after 1 year we can begin expanding the village on an annual basis, as well as expanding the inclusion criteria for subjects. We would first physically expand the village to accommodate another 50 to 100 inhabitants. Depending on the village design, we could either construct more homes, traditional design, or construct another tower and connect it to the first one, tower design. Every year, an evaluation of the gathered data will be made so that we can decide whether we are safe to expand further or if we need to make changes and tweaks to the system before further complicating it by adding more subjects. By the start of the second year of the test village, we should be able to add a full education system and begin including children and families. Each physical expansion of the village should be accompanied by another digital brain or control center. By networking all of the computer control centers and distributing the computational load amongst them, any expansion of the village would always be accompanied by an expansion in the computational power of the whole village, thus ensuring that the systems responsible for running the village will never be overwhelmed. Once children and families and the education system are fully integrated, this would be a good time to start opening the village to public tours. The best way for the people of the world to see the success of this new kind of society would be to witness it with their own eyes. The purpose of this step is to increase the complexity of the experiment by adding more variables, while continually improving the societal design through the surveys and experimental process, thus allowing the experiment to naturally evolve according to the whims of the subjects and the necessities of reality. The most important aspect of this step is the addition of an education system and the inclusion of children and families. This is another very critical point in the RBE experiment. This society must be able to produce happy, well-adjusted, well-educated children. The inclusion of children in this experiment would also mark the beginning of an incredibly interesting psychology experiment. How will children raised in an RBE differ from children raised by contemporary society? Once again, after 1 year of societal stability, we would expand further and begin adding more unpredictable variables. Step 5. Introduce volatile variables. The second set of expansions should be accompanied by the purposeful inclusion of individuals who would have previously been thought of as being a threat to the stability of the RBE test village. The inclusion criteria would now be open to individuals with histories of violent behaviour. Ideally, by this point, numerous test villages will have begun to spring up around the world, thus allowing for us to gather more data and giving the public opportunities for direct access through public tours and the like. This is the final test we must overcome before we are justified in moving to full-scale experiments. The purpose of this step is to see how well an RBE is able to maintain stability in the presence of potentially unstable individuals, and to see the effects of living in an RBE on said individuals. This is very similar to recent experiments performed in communities called kibbutzim in Israel. Essentially, these are small communities based on principles of simple living with extremely low levels of violence compared to the general populace. When former violent offenders live within these communities for some period of time, they become significantly less likely to be incarcerated again. In fact, the longer an offender lives amongst the kibbutz people, the less likely they are to end up becoming repeat offenders. The point these experiments have proven is that a non-violent environment is highly effective treatment for violent individuals. This is precisely the quality that an RBE is supposed to possess, and so it is critical that we test the ability of an RBE to prevent violent behaviour, even in those who are supposed to be more susceptible to it. If the test village is able to survive this ultimate challenge, we will have overcome all of the major changes necessary to prove the small-scale success of a resource-based economy. At this point, the only thing left to do is to move into full-scale testing. Step 6. Establish one or more full-scale colonies/cities. Before we can begin discussing this step, there is a major technological innovation that we must discuss, and it's something I alluded to with very little subtlety in the previous section: the possibility of constructing cities on the ocean. As incredibly far-fetched and futuristic as this idea sounds, it is already being realized in several different forms around the world. The earliest such concepts take the form of very large ships which carry permanent residents, and may include educational facilities, businesses, shopping centres, and their own forms of government. More ambitious models for permanent colonies resembling actual artificial islands have been put forth, but as yet there is no actual construction. There are even well-defined plans for building a city atop a platform of ice. The plan includes instructions on how to harvest a piece of ice from the frozen coast of Antarctica and mechanisms for keeping the ice cold and solid in equatorial waters, thus allowing one of these cities to exist practically anywhere in the ocean. It has been suggested that cities on the ocean would be ideal for testing new kinds of political and economic systems, and could even lead to the formation of so-called micronations. This is an extremely convenient reality for those of us who are attempting to test a new kind of socio-economic system. As I mentioned earlier in this section, there exists a plan for creating a single tower that is able to house a community of 10 to 50,000 people, based upon RBE-like principles. What I did not mention is that this plan also includes the construction of such towers on the ocean, and this is where it all comes together. The RBE experiment is an ideal opportunity to conquer two frontiers at once: the creation of a new kind of society and the colonization of the ocean. The great benefit of being able to colonize the ocean from the perspective of the RBE experiment is that no one owns international waters. There would be no need to buy or secure land, which means that we would simply expand our colonies without worry, provided we stay clear of important shipping lanes and strategic waters. Although it is very tempting to say that we should just go ahead and construct one such colony, I must stress that we should have preliminary data suggesting that such a community would actually function, hence all of the previous steps. However, if we can obtain such data, there is no reason why we should not move to full scale. My recommendation is that we allow the smaller village or villages to run for at least a period of 5 years before we decide to move to full scale. The first tower would be constructed as much as physically possible from resources gathered to an established RBE production facility, therefore reducing or even eliminating the need for any additional capital. For all intents and purposes, the way this city is run would be identical in description to the test village, only on a much larger scale. After we have observed the first tower for a period of at least 2 years, additional towers would be built using resources gathered by the first tower, thus allowing the community to expand and take on additional inhabitants. At this point, Whether this is still an experiment or a real colony is debatable, so I will stop referring to the residents as subjects. Networks of cities would form on the ocean, thus giving rise to one or more micronations. The purpose of this step is to establish a completely autonomous, full-scale colony that will set the stage for the formation of a micronation, thus giving us the best possible test of the RBE system we could have, other than actually implementing it on a global scale. Once we have an established large-scale RBE society that is able to maintain itself with a happy, healthy population, we will finally have the evidence we need to begin pushing for global implementation of a resource-based economy, which of course is the seemingly impossible task that ultimately awaits us. Okay, and we'll leave that there for today. We'll pick it up from the title Leaping into the Unknown at the bottom of page 64 on my next radio show, and actually should be able to finish this audiobook in that next radio show by the looks of things. And as I might have mentioned before, my plan is to compile all of the readings from those radio shows into one audiobook that should hopefully be available through the movement's website and other portals. One thing I would like to reiterate from that reading, as Jas pointed out, is that no one knows the future. We don't know that that will be the plan. We can only use the best method we have for predicting future events, which unequivocally and categorically has been found to be the scientific method. So with this thought in mind, and with the topic of this radio show being meaningful communication, I would like to hand you over to someone who was indeed a master of words and a great advocate of the direction in which our species could head in, should we choose to do so. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Carl Sagan.
Those worlds in space are as countless as all the grains of sand on all the beaches of the earth. Each of those worlds is as real as ours. In every one of them, there's a succession of incidents, events, occurrences, which influence its future. Countless worlds, numberless moments, an immensity of space and time. And our small planet, at this moment, here we face a critical branch point in history. What we do with our world right now will propagate down through the centuries and powerfully affect the destiny of our descendants. It is well within our power to destroy our civilization and perhaps our species as well. If we capitulate to superstition or greed or stupidity, we can plunge our world into a darkness deeper than the time between the collapse of classical civilization and the Italian Renaissance. But we are also capable of using our compassion and our intelligence, our technology and our wealth to make an abundant and meaningful life for every inhabitant of this planet, to enhance enormously our understanding of the universe and to carry us to the stars.